Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. In this video, which I imagine will be a longer one, but in this video, my goal is to talk about some short-term outcomes for Bitcoin, discuss the ramifications of those, right? And again, I don't know what way it's going to go in the short term, but we'll discuss potential paths. I also want to talk about, some longer-term views. We'll of course provide updates based on where is the economy right now and where does crypto factor into that. And I do want to answer some common questions that I see, because I've gotten a lot of questions over the last year. And, I do tend to answer them sporadically, but I would at least like to answer some of them in this video. But before we get to all of that, I just want to sort of talk a little bit about where Bitcoin is right now. So again, right now, Bitcoin's currently coming in at 36K. It had a fairly explosive rally here. Okay. So a fairly explosive rally to essentially take out these prior highs, right? This prior resistance level that was holding down Bitcoin. It was holding Bitcoin down for a long time, right? So you can see that the Bitcoin finally took that out. And since then, since that breakout, right, you can see that Bitcoin, continued to rally about another 20%. So the first thing we maybe should do is look back in history and find other periods where there was some resistance level where we finally broke through, and then what happened after it. Okay, so we're not going to go too far back in history, but we can at least go back and look at the prior cycle and maybe look at a couple of examples. So there's one example right here that you'll find in, from late 2019, there was a resistance level, and that resistance level really acted as resistance from October of 2019 through February 2020, even in June of 2020, and then we finally broke through it in July of 2020. And when we broke through it, Bitcoin rallied about 20% or so. So similar to what it's done today, right? About a similar move as to what it's done today. Following that, we did get about a 20% retracement. Now, again, back over here, if you guys were watching the channel back then on this retracement, we were hoping that Bitcoin would in fact hold the line. The reason we were hoping that was because we had already had all the other prior really signals that we were looking for, and we were also in a period of quantitative easing. Everything was just going higher. The assumption was that if Bitcoin holds the line, then it will explode to the upside, right? That was the assumption. And that's what we said back then. There's 6 weeks of videos, essentially where every single week I put out a video called hold the line, right? In hopes that we would get this rally. And it did. And it occurred, of course, after, breaking out of all these prior resistance levels. And then we eventually backtested that. In fact, we went slightly below that level, right? You can see that this level corresponded to about 10.4K, and we actually went below that level down to around $9,700, $9,800. But where did it find support? The bull market support band, which again is a combination of the 20-week SMA and the 21-week EMA. Now, if you look at other periods, right, you can certainly find examples where support levels were created that then Bitcoin eventually fell below, right? So just because you create a support level does not mean that the market is immune from ever going below that level. For instance, you can find plenty of examples, right? Like here's a good example where Bitcoin was trying to set a floor at around $7,400. We held it as support here. We held it as support here. But then eventually we failed to hold it as support. And especially once a recession got priced in, we basically took out all of these prior support levels, right? Even this one over here around 6K that, was support for a while. We got back above it. We went all the way below that. But that did not happen until a recession arrived, right? Until that point, the structure, the integrity, the integrity of the uptrend remained intact, right? It markets climb the wall of worry until they have a sufficient reason not to do so, especially, for assets that are fundamentally valuable, right? I mean, you can find, thousands of altcoins that don't do that, right? They don't just trend higher until they have a reason not to do so. They trend lower until maybe the Fed prints a lot of money, and then they just spike up. But there's sort of counterpoints as well. I mean, there's another counterpoint over here, right, where, for a long time, Bitcoin was sort of trying to hold this level at around 30K or so, but eventually we fell below. So we can find periods where Bitcoin, occasionally experiences a breakout, and a lot of times it will often come back down, sort of retest that zone at some point in the future. It doesn't have to happen immediately, but at some point in the future, we do tend to come back down and test that level. One way to visualize that is to look at the 100-week moving average, right? So if you look at, say, 2 cycles ago, what you'll notice is that when Bitcoin broke out above the 100-week SMA, it was about a 22% rally, 23% rally. It then fell back about 23% to backtest that 100-week moving average, right? We backtested that 100-week moving average, held it as support, and then the rest is history, right? I mean, we went up for a long time. Last cycle was a little different because we broke through it. It was a stronger rally. It was about a 100% move. We backtested the 100-week SMA just like the cycle before, but we eventually fell below it. So you can see 2 clearly different paths that were taken. One cycle where we break above the 100-week moving average, we hold it as support, and then we don't revisit it again for, almost 3 years. That was what happened over here. But in this cycle, something different happened, right? We got above the 100-week. We tried to hold it as support, but eventually a recession hit and we went below it. So where are we today? So you can kind of see we've broken above it again. So far, it's gone up about 33%. So it's gone up more than what it did in 2015 before backtesting it, but less than what it did in 2019. The argument here is that eventually we will test the 100-week moving average. Now, whether it holds as support will likely be dependent on macroeconomic conditions as to whether we go into a recession or not. I've put out a lot of videos where we talk about risks of a recession and how you can prepare for that. I do not know if a recession will occur. I don't. There's evidence to suggest that there's likely going to be one at the end of this business cycle, but I don't know when that's going to be. It could have already started, right? I mean, we could already be in one. It could be another year away, right? I don't know. I simply don't. There's also a chance that we get a recession scare like 2016 rather than an actual recession like 2020. So we have to consider that. But when you look at where the 100-week SMA is right now, it's currently at 28K. Now, remember, last cycle, when we broke above the 100-week SMA, we did eventually backtest it as support. And you can also remember, too, when I just talked about this a little bit ago, once we broke out of these resistance levels, we got to a point where we came back down, back tested it, but also held the bull market support band as support. So where does that leave us today, right? Where does that leave us today? Well, there's two obvious, there's two potential outcomes in the short term, right? It could go up or down, right? I guess there's three. It could go sideways. But the thing about it going sideways is that eventually it'll still go up or down, right? I mean, if it goes sideways for a month, it's not like it won't ever go up or down. So like the two outcomes are that it will go up or down. If it goes sideways, if Bitcoin goes sideways at elevated levels, like at 36, 37K, we know the altcoin market can run. We've seen it run. I've said that that's the most likely outcome if Bitcoin stays at elevated levels. It's when Bitcoin pulls back that those altcoins can struggle some. So if Bitcoin pulls back, to maintain the integrity of the uptrend, you would want to see it hold the bull market support band or, these prior highs. I don't even think the wicks would have to hold, but you would want to see, 30K hold, hold as support, just like it did over here. But remember, support levels can break down if the economy goes into a downturn, okay? So, that's where we are today. Now, I've had a lot of questions, Rick, for people, right? And I mean, I'm sure, a lot of you guys already sort of know where I stand. So a lot of this is just going to be repetitive, but I feel like just for the sake of transparency, and so I'm not, just to be completely open and honest, I want to answer some of these questions. So one question is, well, there's several questions, right? But one question is, why do you own Bitcoin if you think a recession is going to happen, right? I mean, I've said for the last 2 years, the only cryptocurrency I've even bought is Bitcoin, right? The only one I've bought. In ITC Premium, which again we're having a sale on, but in ITC Premium in late 2022, I sort of shared where my limit orders were. So then it sort of goes against the idea though of like, well, what happens if we get a recession? Well, what I've learned is you have to be hedged throughout the market cycles, right? And the way that I hedged myself is to just have Bitcoin. Now, why would I have Bitcoin if I think there's a risk of a recession? Well, first of all, we have to be honest with ourselves, say we don't know if and when a recession is going to happen. Second of all, having Bitcoin helps you hedge against other things happening that don't necessarily seem like the most likely outcome. The other thing is, well, is that even if we do get a recession, markets often rally into them, right? You could have a situation where markets rally for months, which is actually normally what happens when the Fed pauses. It's normally what happens, before a recession strikes. You can have the market rally for months before a recession takes hold and the grim reality for risk assets, including cryptocurrencies, finally sets in. So that's the reason why I have Bitcoin. And so it helps me deal with like the FOMO, right? Like I know I have I know I have a bag, and so if it keeps going up, I don't feel the urge as much to FOMO in because I feel like I'm getting left behind, right? I have some. Now that doesn't necessarily help with the FOMO of the altcoin market, right? Because I have been pretty clear that I haven't been interested in the altcoin market for the last 2 years, really 2.5 years. But I mean, more vocally 2 years. And the reason for that, is it because I think altcoins cannot rally? No, they can, right? We've seen tons of rallies in the altcoin market over the last 2 to 2.5 years. I remember the summer of 2022 quite vividly. Total 3 was absolutely crushing it, right? I mean, the altcoin market was just constantly going up for basically 2 months straight, And I had to live with myself back then with basically not getting any, not getting any altcoins and saying, you know what, I'm going to stick with Bitcoin. And the same thing, right? The same thing occurred in March of 2022. The same thing occurred in February 2023, in April 2023, and even July of 2023, and then even today, right? We've had no shortage of really impressive rallies in the altcoin market. Absolutely no shortage of them. A lot of people have made a lot of money, and that is great for them. I'm not trying to take anything away from that. I thought it would be useful to sort of kind of outline how I'm navigating the market for people. Although I am starting to come to terms with maybe that's not the most helpful, because then some people sort of mimic exactly what I'm doing, right? They'll have a Bitcoin stack, they'll have some cash in case a recession hits, but then they're sitting there on their hands wondering what the hell to do when the altcoin market is moving up 20% in a week, right? But I go back to this idea that there's 2 potential outcomes, right? There's 2 potential outcomes that I consider to be the most likely outcomes, okay? Number 1 is that the structure of the uptrend remains intact, and the series of higher lows and higher highs for Bitcoin USD remains intact. Now, if that is the case, if the structure remains intact, then that means it's only a matter of time before Bitcoin goes up again, right? If the structure remains intact. But one of the things that we've seen all year long is that anytime Bitcoin moves up, the Bitcoin dominance moves up. I can't tell you how many times over the last year, 2 years, because when you exclude stablecoins, dominance has been going up for 2.5 years. But I cannot tell you how many times over the last 2.5 years I've seen people say, well, I know you're bullish on Bitcoin dominance, but so-and-so, they say the top is in, right? I've heard it for 2 years, right? I keep hearing it. And then you fast forward, and then there's just another top put in, right? That we dominance goes to a higher level. And then all those same things come back of like, well, okay, Ben's still bullish on the Bitcoin dominance, but this person over here, they say the top is in. Trying to time the top on dominance is a difficult task. The reason why I still think it's going higher, although I could be wrong, right? I could be wrong. But one of the reasons why I think it's moving higher is because I would expect that during tighter conditions, during higher interest rates, during a period where the access to capital is not as readily available as it was a couple of years ago, my expectation would be that higher risk assets bleed to lower risk assets. That is my assumption, right? That's my assumption. It could be a faulty assumption. So far, it's worked out great, right? The dominance continues to go higher, but it could be a faulty assumption. But so I think to myself, well, if the integrity of the uptrend remains intact, then the Bitcoin dominance should go up. And if the Bitcoin dominance goes up, why would I speculate too much in the altcoin market? Now, there's a lot of people that are great at short-term trades and love, trading the altcoin market in the short term and sort of scalping trades and whatnot, and they make a lot of money doing it. A lot of people lose a lot of money doing it too. But I think back to myself, well, if I want to put money into crypto, I'll just put it in Bitcoin, right? Because Bitcoin leads the bull market, right? Bitcoin leads the bull market. It's not the altcoin market. If the altcoin market moves, it's only because Bitcoin moved first. Do you remember me saying that a few months ago when we were talking about the dominance over here in September? And I said back then, if Bitcoin goes up, the dominance is going to go up. And if the altcoin market ends up moving, it's only because Bitcoin went up first. And the fact that dominance today is higher than it was in August and September shows you that collectively the altcoin market has underperformed Bitcoin. That doesn't mean that every single altcoin has. There's plenty of them that have gone up against Bitcoin. But collectively, we know that the altcoin market has underperformed Bitcoin since that time. Now, over the last couple of weeks, sure, the Bitcoin dominance is down, right? But it does not change the fact that dominance has continued to move up. So scenario one is that Bitcoin leads the bull market, and if the series of higher lows and higher highs remains intact, then I would expect Bitcoin to lead the way and for altcoins to bleed back to Bitcoin. If you think back to the stock market, the stock market has been mostly run by the Magnificent Seven. If you take out the Magnificent Seven, then you basically get an index that has done much of nothing for the last couple of years or so. But in the same way, in the stock market, you have micro caps or medium cap stocks bleeding to the likes of Apple and Microsoft and Google. In crypto, you have the likes of altcoins generally bleeding back to Bitcoin, right? So instead of the Magnificent Seven, it's just the Magnificent One. It's just there's one asset that is clearly above the rest in terms of its longevity, in terms of the risk associated with it, in terms of not having the same regulatory risk as the altcoin market, and so on, right? So in that case, again, If the uptrend remains intact, then dominance should go higher. If Bitcoin drops, what happens, right? I mean, if Bitcoin were to drop back down here and say retest the 100-week moving average, let's say at 28K, 29K, 30K, something like that, the altcoin market would take a pretty big hit. So I think that's relevant to look at as well. I mean, Bitcoin is showing a lot of relative strength, even against Ethereum, right? Even against Ethereum. So that is something you have to ultimately consider. And when I look at this structure over here of these support levels, the way that they could eventually get broken would be a recession. As long as the economy holds up, then the market can climb the wall of worry. One of the things I've said is that the market loves climbing the wall of worry until you get one of two things: either the reacceleration of inflation or the labor market finally shows weakness. I think disinflation is more likely to happen at this point, and I've said that for the last 6 months, than hyperinflation or the reacceleration of inflation, as long as the Fed stays to what they're, to what they've said. But that still remains to be seen, right? So as long as the labor market holds up, the integrity of the uptrend can remain intact. But if the labor market falters, then just like over here, a lot of these support levels can get taken out in a month, right? You can spend months building out support only for, a single monthly candle to completely erase it. Okay? So we must consider that as a potential outcome. Now, in the short term, I don't know if this is going to retrace immediately to the 100-week SMA or not. I don't know. I've seen some people look at it like this. Okay, so if you look at the fib retracement tool, there are some people that are looking at the 618 as the target because that is where it went in 2019, right? The 618, which would still be 12, 13K higher than where we are today. Now, that's true that could happen, right? The cycle before that, though, we should at least acknowledge that while we did eventually make it to the 618, we didn't get there until the end of the halving year. So it was literally another 13 months from now, basically, until we even got to the 618. So if you only had one data point, you might assume that it has to happen immediately. With two data points, you can see that there's really no telling when something like that has to happen. If you were to go look at the year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin and not even compare it to the average of the last two pre-halving years, but just look at it compared to 2019, this is exactly where the year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin was at this point in 2019. This is exactly where it was. If you add the average of the last two pre-halving years, you can see that it's above the historical, the average of those 2 years. Now, could Bitcoin get a pullback going into the end of the year? I doubt it's a popular view, right? And I mean, you guys know me. I'm always going to talk about the downside risk. I assume it's just in my nature, but I'm always going to talk about the downside risk. It certainly seems like it's certainly not something people necessarily appreciate. I could just make the videos, just sort of cheering for more upside constantly, but I think it's always worthwhile to consider the downside risk in any market. And I suppose the narrative that would sort of follow a pullback into the end of the year would be that if the spot ETF for Bitcoin is not approved immediately and that hype kind of wears off for a couple of months, then you could sort of see it retrace back down to where it initially broke out of and retest that as support. It doesn't have to happen immediately, right? It could break up and then break down and test it. But that is, that's at least a plausible outcome that we should consider is that if it does pull back, you would look to it potentially holding, either at the prior high or just below it if the integrity of the uptrend is to remain intact, where you have a series of higher lows. Okay? And if that were to happen, I do imagine the altcoin market would get hit. If Bitcoin had like a 20% pullback or something. Because I mean, like if you look at total 3, it actually just rallied to the 100-week SMA, in fact. And I mean, you can see that That's where it did it over here. It did it again right there. That was where the recession hit. This is the first time it's really been up here in quite a long time. So, I mean, look, if Bitcoin gets a pullback, the altcoin market would get a pullback too, and likely at some point down to the bull market support band, which ranges from 344 billion to 353 billion. But of course, it's going to move up aggressively with these weekly candles moving up as aggressively as they have been. So that's something that is I think up for consideration as well, is that the altcoin market has experienced a sizable rally. At some point, it'll get a pullback. It'll likely be on the back of a pullback by Bitcoin, a more substantial pullback, because like on lower time frames, Bitcoin has still been trending higher, right, on lower time frames, but on sort of like the when you sort of zoom out, we haven't really seen that pullback yet. And it's interesting because if you look at how these higher lows have gone so far, we tend to get a higher low every 3 months or so, right? So we had one here, and then the next one was about 3 months later, maybe a little more than 3 months later. And then here we had a higher low that was about, again, so this was 15 weeks, and this one was 14 weeks. And then from this low to this one, it was about 13 weeks. So you can see that we tend to get one of these higher lows between 13 to 15 weeks apart. Now, if you go 13 to 15 weeks out from this low right here in September, 13 weeks puts you in the week of December 11th. 15 weeks puts you basically the last week of the year. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that if the spot ETF is not approved imminently and sort of the hype dies down for a little bit, and Bitcoin does get a pullback, right? I mean, even if you're bullish, I imagine even the bulls would always say that, yeah, you could have a higher low. The bears, of course, would always look for, is it going to go down and put in a lower low? But if you're bullish, you would be looking for, in fact, a higher low. And if it is going to maintain sort of this structure of about every 3, maybe 3.5 months, then it would put you expecting another significant low sometime in mid to late December. Okay, you can see that Bitcoin has had like these explosive rallies, and then it sort of just goes back down and puts in a higher low, right? Explosive rally, fade back down, explosive rally, fade, explosive rally, and then the question is does it fade? Now, if it does fade, then that could correspond to back testing that 100-week moving average, which is what we've previously seen happen last cycle and the cycle before that, right? Back testing that 100-week moving average. So that would, I think, be the obvious area to look to see if it can, in fact, hold as support. That's sort of the more bullish view. But you could also look at this and argue that there is still reason to be concerned about, that some of these structural levels could eventually break down if the economy goes into a more significant downturn. One interesting thing that I've observed previously, and one of the videos I put out on my channel back in 2019, and arguably I got lucky by saying this, I will at least acknowledge that. But in 2019, in late 2019, I put out a video saying that, basically looking at this observation, right? I basically said, all right, in the first cycle, it basically held support at the 100-week. Like final support was around the 100-week moving average, right? In the second cycle, final support was closer to around the 200-week moving average. Now, we did get a wick lower, right, down to the 300-week later on. And then in the third cycle, I said, well, guys, I mean, like if we can go to the 100-week here and the 200-week here with a wick to the 300-week last cycle, then why can't the 300-week happen again? And it did. In fact, it did. 200-week here, 300-week here. If you remember back to late 2022, one of the things I suggested was that there does exist an outcome where we go to, say, like the 400-week moving average, but by the time we make it there, it could be at a higher low for Bitcoin, right? It could be like more than a year out into the future, right? We went to the 200-week, we fell below it. We went to the 300-week, we fell below it, right? And I said right here, there's a chance that we go to the 400-week, but if we do, it could happen like a year and a half later, just like it did last cycle into this recession. So the 400-week right now is at 17K, right? So it would correspond to a higher low if we were in fact to hit that level. But you're not going to hit that level more than likely unless you go into a recession, right? So a lot of people, I feel like, they feel stuck. Maybe you have some Bitcoin, maybe you don't, but you're looking at all the same economic indicators that I am, and you're like, well, what are you supposed to do? It seems like the economy is slowing down. It seems like the labor market is loosening up, but risk assets just keep on climbing, right? They keep on going up. That's pretty normal, right? It's pretty normal for markets to climb the wall of worry, because while the labor market has softened up a little bit, it's still not yet obvious that it's recession territory. If you were to look at like initial claims, they're still relatively low, right? Like they are starting to trend up, but they're still relatively low. There's no guarantee that they're going to there's no guarantee that they're going to go make a higher high. On the other hand, while people have been getting laid off essentially at the same pace, continued claims are showing a little bit more of a warning sign, right? It's showing that while people are getting laid off at the same pace, they're having a harder time finding a new job. Continued claims are higher now than at any point in 2022. The reason why that is relevant is if you look at the unemployment rate versus continued claims, or on the same chart, you can see that continued claims going higher tends to lead the unemployment rate higher, right? You're not going to really find many instances where the continued claims goes up and the unemployment rate does not. And you can see over here, continued claims are starting to aggressively move higher, and it looks like the unemployment rate is starting to follow. So I can't not consider that, right? I can't not consider that with how I navigate the market. So what I do is I have a bag of Bitcoin in case we just keep climbing the wall of worry, right? In case we just keep on going up and the market continues to scream higher, right? But I also think, and again, you can laugh at me if you want, right? But I think it's worthwhile to have some cash on hand in case the Federal Reserve pushes us into a recession. I don't know. Maybe it's silly, right? Maybe it's silly. I mean, call me a fixed income investor in some regards, but I'm pretty happy with having a bag of Bitcoin, having some cash in case we drop, and being comfortable with that. Now, do I sometimes look at the altcoin market and think, gosh, man, that really went up a lot, right? That really went up a lot, and I really wish I'd had a bag of that. Look, guys, FOMO affects everyone, right? I'm not going to sit here and act like, if I knew an asset was going to go up 100%, right? Like, of course, I would have wanted to have that. I'm not a Bitcoin maxi, despite what many people say. I just want to manage my risk. I want to manage my risk-adjusted returns. And a lot of assets have seen explosive rallies to the upside, right? But I do come back to this chart over here, and I still don't yet see necessarily a durable breakout. So this is the altcoin market, taking out USDT and then dividing all that by Bitcoin. And this has not yet broken out into a higher high. Total 3 has, but this is not with respect to Bitcoin. So I look at this and I say, has anything changed? Have I been better off with Bitcoin for the last 2 years, or would I have been better off with the altcoin market? I still think Bitcoin has been the better play. I do. At the same time, just to be honest, right? At the same time, I don't know if I want to continue to wear this hat of just sort of being, vocally against altcoins because I think they're bleeding against Bitcoin. While I appreciate Bitcoin valuations, and I think those are the most relevant things, I can also recognize that a lot of the people that watch my channel do not care at all about that, at all. And every time the altcoin market goes up at all, it's just like, well, okay, there Ben is sitting on the sidelines of the altcoin market because he's just watching the Bitcoin dominance go up, right? So, my goal in all this was to just say, look, altcoins are going to bleed back to Bitcoin. And if you want exposure in crypto in a bear market year or a pre-halving year, you're generally going to be better off with Bitcoin rather than trying to go pick an altcoin. Now, there's some of you that picked out some altcoins and they did really, really well. Congratulations. I've done the same thing in prior cycles, right? I mean, like last cycle, I was buying some altcoins and many of them did well, but I still saw them fade. I still saw some of them fade eventually. Some of them held up. And I just look back at it and I'm like, well, I wouldn't necessarily have been wrong to just stick with Bitcoin. At the end of 2022, I basically had I remember I was pacing around thinking, how do I want to do this? Do I just focus on Bitcoin dominance? What do I focus on? And I was like, well, to me, like that's the most important thing is managing your risk. And if everything's just going to bleed, or if most everything's just going to bleed back to Bitcoin, then why would I get too optimistic about the altcoin market? But I also recognize that's a harder path to take because a lot of people aren't going to care about their Bitcoin valuations. So, in the halving year, my expectation is that altcoins will start to turn the tide against Bitcoin at some point in the halving year. It's possible that they've already done so, right? But I would say that at some point in the halving year, altcoins will turn the tide against Bitcoin and start to outperform in a more durable fashion. At this point, it has not been durable. Every single pump that alts have had since September of 2021 against Bitcoin has been a lower high. Right? They've all just been lower highs. A ton of money to be made, right? A ton of money to be made if you could time the lows. But they've all been lower highs. Is this a double bottom? Could be. Could have been over here as well. But it wasn't, and it broke down. Do you know why it broke down over here? I don't know why it's going to, if it breaks down this time, I don't know if it will be for the same reason. Let me be clear. I don't know if it will be for the same reason. But the reason alts broke down against Bitcoin last cycle in 2019 was on a Bitcoin rally. It was on this final Bitcoin rally in the pre-halving year. What's interesting about that rally is that it corresponded to 1 or 2 months before interest rates started going down. The economy was weak, right? High-risk assets like cryptocurrencies don't tend to do well when the economy is weak. The economy was weak back then. We had an inverted yield curve in 2019, right? A lot of people don't remember it. We had an inverted yield curve in 2019. There were a lot of articles saying there will be no recession in 2020. And we got one. Now, we got one because of a pandemic, and there's no way we'll ever know if we would have gone into a recession otherwise. I'm not here to suggest that the pandemic was something that we could have predicted. But I would say that the economy was not looking that great back then. And if you had to ask yourself, if the economy was so great in 2019, why was the Fed cutting rates? Like, it would have made no sense. If the economy was so great, why was the Fed cutting? Right? It's because the economy wasn't that great. That's why the Fed was cutting. It was, in fact, a Bitcoin rally that broke all Bitcoin pairs down. It wasn't a Bitcoin dump. It could be a Bitcoin dump this time. If you look closely, anytime Bitcoin starts to drop, dominance is going up, right? It is. Look at some lower time frames here. I don't really like to get into the nitty-gritty of hourly stuff, but let's just take a look, and you can see the relative weakness of some things against Bitcoin. You see Bitcoin? You see this hourly candles? It's higher lows. Right? Higher lows over the last few days. What about Ethereum? It's not, right? This was a higher low, but then it just put in a lower low. So this shows you that if Bitcoin were to experience a more serious downturn, like let's call it 10, 20%, maybe back down to the breakout point of like 31K, it would likely negatively impact the altcoin market. more so than it would Bitcoin. This shows you that this is the case. What's interesting is if you look closely at what happened in 2019, what you'll notice is that dominance did not top when Bitcoin topped. Look at this. Bitcoin topped in June. Dominance did not top until September. 3 months after Bitcoin topped. And Bitcoin just put in new highs, within the last couple of weeks. Dominance did not top until September. In fact, when Bitcoin topped, the dominance of Bitcoin was only 65%. But then dominance continued to go up to almost 73%. The king leads the bull run. And if we go into a recession, alts are likely going to initially bleed to Bitcoin. You can see that as the downturn continued, dominance started to come back down, but only after they were done bleeding against Bitcoin for that tightening cycle. The other thing to consider with dominance is that it did not top last cycle, right? It did not top last cycle until after the Fed started cutting, right? Fed started cutting in July. Dominance topped in September. A few months ago, I was talking with some people and they were pretty hopeful that dominance had already topped it at 52% back in June, because it was around the same time and we had made it to September. It hadn't put in a higher high, and it seemed like it wasn't going to a lot of people, because that was when it had topped out last cycle. But if you think about it, like, if it's going to play out like last cycle, do you look at just the time frame at which it topped out and say that, oh, it has to top out in September or August in September because that's when it did last cycle? Or do we acknowledge that it topped out last cycle perhaps because we were going back to looser monetary policy, and therefore riskier assets could now finally hold their own against lower risk assets like Bitcoin? Perhaps that was the reason, right? Perhaps that was the reason. Now, a lot of people have already started giving me a hard time about Bitcoin dominance again. But the one thing I'd like to point out is we called this move. In like the second or third week, I said that this is likely going to follow the dollar's move in terms of like 10 weekly candles in a row. Just like the dollar did. Got like 11 weekly candles in a row, right? Yes. This has been a pullback by dominance from 54% all the way down to 51.5%. But where we are currently is not even below where we opened the 10th green week, right? The 10th green week. Now, if you go take a look at the dollar, it's seen a pretty significant pullback recently, right? This is a pretty big drop by the dollar. I didn't really think it was going to go this low, to be completely honest. But here it is. So it's certainly possible that dominance takes another hit, right? It's possible. I'm not going to sit here and say it can't happen. We've seen that as long as Bitcoin stays at 36K, 37K, we know that alts can move. We've seen alts move basically every week for the last month. So I'm not going to say that dominance can't drop. We know that it could. It could. I mean, if you look at the bull market support band for dominance, it's all the way at 50.76%. I mean, that's another 2% off of this before it even gets back to the bull market support band. Right, so I'm not going to say it can't drop. It certainly could. But I would also say that Bitcoin won't sit at 36K forever. It's either going to aggressively move higher on a spot ETF news or something, and the dominance will likely go up again because that's what it's been doing all year, or it'll get this pullback to the 100-week SMA, and we've seen on lower time frames that altcoins are struggling against Bitcoin. We've seen that on lower time frames when Bitcoin pulls back. So that's where I stand on the altcoin market. I want to be clear, guys. If you want to go invest in the altcoin market, just go do it, right? Like don't look for someone else to give you the green light. I mean, I've explained what I'm doing. I've explained why I'm doing it. I've explained that I'm okay missing out on rallies in the altcoin market, but you don't necessarily have the same risk tolerance as me. Maybe you want to be a lot more aggressive than I do, and that's fine. I will say that again, as we get into the halving year, I'm going to sort of relinquish this view. I'm not going to be so vocal about it nearly as much, because I sort of recognize that it's not, no matter what happens, it's not a popular view. I mean, if dominance goes to 56% and then pulls back to 54%, then I have to deal with the same thing all over again, right? And if it goes to 58% and then pulls back to 56%, right? It's just the same thing, right? It's the same thing over and over and over again. And I don't really want to put myself into that position anymore, right? Like, I'd rather just be like, yeah, like, okay, fine. You can go look at the altcoin. Maybe check its Bitcoin pair, but fine. Like, you'll go look at the altcoin if that entices you. If you look, by the way, at last cycle, if you look at Bitcoin dominance, last cycle, if I could find it, I'm already on the screen. What am I doing? I've sort of pointed this out before, but from the breakdown point, you'll see that dominance rallied back up to the 618, right, before it topped out in 2019. And interestingly enough, I mean, you can see that it did struggle to break through some of these thresholds, but right now it's currently at the 382, which is funny because that's where Bitcoin USD is as well, right? Like, if you go look at Bitcoin USD on its fib retracement, it's also at the 382, right? Which is kind of interesting, right? You have Bitcoin USD at the 382, you have Bitcoin dominance at the 382. If Bitcoin USD went to the 618 or the 0.5 level, I would assume that dominance is going to go with it. And there also exists a scenario where Bitcoin USD does not make that move and it goes down and the dominance still goes up. This move over here, where dominance went up, was not when Bitcoin was going up. It was while Bitcoin was going sort of down, sort of sideways with a slightly bearish bias. This move was when Bitcoin was going up. Sorry. This move was when Bitcoin was going up. This final move that dominance got from the 0.5 to the 618 was actually after Bitcoin had already topped out, right? So you could have an example where dominance goes up, even if Bitcoin rallies, and then maybe dominance keeps going up as Bitcoin's topping out, and it goes all the way up to the 618. All right, that's a scenario that could happen, right? Think that could happen. It's a difficult position to be in because we can look at the macro data and drive ourselves crazy, trying to sort of wait this thing out, look for the uninversion of the yield curve, all this stuff. These business cycles can take years. They can take a really long time. The only way that I can navigate this with any peace of mind is to have a bag of Bitcoin and to have some cash in case it collapses. If I were to sit here and just sit on my hands, and do nothing, and just continue to look at the macro stuff and not have anything, I'd drive myself crazy, right? I mean, like, I've also have index funds, right? Because like, I get it. The market could collapse, and that's what you have cash for, right? That's what you have cash for. It's all about sort of managing your risk. So that's kind of, I think, where we are. I do want to, Ethereum has been sort of like an interesting spot for me because it's sort of like a sore point. I really do like ETH fundamentally, despite what Twitter might say. But first of all, I don't think any altcoin is going to be flipping Ethereum anytime soon. I also don't think Ethereum is flipping Bitcoin, right? I mean, I think the status quo will remain unchanged in that regard. With that said, I have been very vocal about the Ether Bitcoin pair. I have been very vocal about this being in sort of a macro distribution phase. And what's interesting from my perspective when I talk about this stuff is that, you know, first, when I talked about this distribution phase, right? I was mocked every week. Every week they mocked me. Every single pump I was ridiculed on Twitter, right? I didn't even want to look at Twitter because of whatever, you know, everything that was being said. But I come back and look at this today and I'm just like, it was right? Like it was the merge marked the top. The merge marked the top of this move. And it wasn't even the high from the cycle. Because I turned bearish on Ether Bitcoin right there in May of 2022, just before the drop. It almost seemed perfect because I turned bearish on it. I published a video, and then within like a few days, Ether Bitcoin had dropped from like 0.075 to 0.049. I thought I was a genius. I thought I was a genius. I'm like, wow, I couldn't have timed it any better. And then the market humbled me, like it does all of us at some point. And this thing went right back up. Right back up. I was like, all right, back to the drawing board, I guess. Perhaps it's just a secondary distribution phase, just like Bitcoin USD had in 2021. Remember Bitcoin USD, 4 tops, early 2021. In late 2021, it was the double top at like 60, like 63K and then 69K or something like that. It's like, well, what if Ether Bitcoin's doing the same thing? What if? It was right. But now, they don't even talk about that anymore on Twitter, right? They just sort of ignore it. They ignore that the Ether Bitcoin pair is at 0.053. Now, it's more so they're looking at Ether USD and saying, oh, well, Ben should have bought Ethereum because it's gone up from $1,000 to $2,000. Yeah, I mean, would I have liked to have had some ETH from 1,000 to 2,000? Well, sure. But I also bought Bitcoin last year. And we know that Ether Bitcoin has bled. So for every dollar that I would have put into Ethereum over here, that was $1 I could have put into Bitcoin. Meaning that was opportunity cost. Ethereum is down from the merge, is down 37% against Bitcoin. 37%. So yes, could I bought Ethereum? Would I be happy today? Yeah, probably, because it's up on its USD pair. Right? It's up. Bitcoin's up a lot more. It was right to focus on the Bitcoin dominance. The Bitcoin dominance told us that if you want to invest in crypto, Bitcoin is likely where you want to be. Yes, we can go cherry pick a few altcoins now. Survivorship bias is a hell of a drug, but Bitcoin was the safer play by far. And, I'm almost scared to even post this chart because I know the likelihood that it's going to play out is relatively low. Okay? It's relatively low. But I do want to at least show it. Okay? I do want to at least show it not because I think it has to play out. Because again, if I had to say the odds of it playing out exactly how I'm going to show, probably really low. Probably really low. Ethereum has continued to put in one higher low after another. Okay? Bitcoin's outperformed it every step of the way. The people that gave me crap about the Ether Bitcoin last year now give me crap about Ether USD this year. I wonder what they're going to say next year, right? I'll find something else too. But one thing to look at, and I sort of saw this and I can't get it out of my mind, so I'll just sort of mention it to you guys, is this chart. Okay? Now, I don't know if we get a recession. I want to be clear. I don't know. Let me say it again. I don't know if we get a recession. I have no idea. It could not happen. Perhaps we get a soft landing like 1967. Perhaps we just go to the moon and sing songs together off into the sunset. Okay? I don't know. But there is some patterns that I thought were interesting, and that was to look at this chart. There's a pattern, right, where you're in a downtrend And then you start off into a rising wedge, and you can kind of see this, right? You put in a low and then you put in a high. The important part of this is that the support is at a more steep angle. The angle of attack is more aggressive than the resistance. So you had the merge hype right here. You had the meme coin season deflationary narrative, in April. If you guys remember that, where a lot of those meme coins basically just went to zero. And then now it's all about the spot ETF. But what's interesting is that, and I sort of just, sort of took these points here. The rising wedge is a technical chart pattern used to identify possible trend reversals. It appears as an upward sloping price chart featuring two converging trend lines. It is usually accompanied by decreasing trading volume. What do you see down here? Decreasing trading volume. Wedges can either form in the rising or falling direction. Rising wedge is often considered a bearish chart pattern that indicates a potential breakdown to the downside, potential breakout to the downside. So when I look at this chart, I could see it going either way. Honestly, I could see it going either way. It could break to the upside here. Okay? What's the invalidation? I guess if it goes like 2,300, 2,400, because I mean, like right now, the top of this channel is probably is somewhere between 22 to 2,300, right? But again, it slowly goes up. So the longer we take to get there, it would be a little bit higher. But if Ether is above 2,300, then this is completely invalidated, and we throw it out the window and we say, right, that's wrong. But I mean, if it's not, right, if it just gets rejected and we come back down, then this is possibly, a trend reversal. Then I look at this and I'm like, well, hell, Bitcoin's gone up a lot and Ethereum can't even get past 2K right now. What's going on? I don't know. If you look at Bitcoin, this is a crazy move. Ethereum has not yet joined in. Now, Ethereum does tend to be the last thing to move in a mania phase. So that could be sort of what's going on. So maybe it hasn't broken out yet because of that. But I mean, there's really no denying the weakness of the Ether Bitcoin pair. And when I look at this, one of the things that I think is worth noting is that it's trying to hold on at the same level that it tried to hold on to last time. And it's almost playing out in an eerily similar fashion, right? You get a red candle down, then you get two green candles and then a red candle, right? Two greens and then a red. We're in the red right now. What happened last time when we came down to these lows is then we got 1 week where Ether Bitcoin was basically sideways. And then the next week, it exploded back up to the upside. Absolutely explosive move by the Ether Bitcoin valuation into the merge. And I know there is some seasonality associated with Ether Bitcoin. I know there is, and I'm not going to pretend like it doesn't exist. Normally what happens is that if there's going to be a move, it starts sometime either in December or January. Right? You can see here and here. This started in December, January. This started in December and January as well. You can find this started in December, started here again in December, January, so on and so forth, right? You'll find plenty of times where the Ether Bitcoin pair got a nice rally starting in that December, January timeframe. That's coming up soon, right? It's coming up soon. Guess what, though? Last year, we didn't get it. Last year, we didn't get it at all. Well, maybe slightly, right? I mean, it went up a little bit, and then it just collapsed for the rest of the year. So the seasonality that has historically played out does not always play out. I talk about seasonality a lot, and a lot of times it gets me into trouble. About 30% of the time I get into trouble for talking about it. Because, I don't know, like 30% of the time, we don't follow what tends to happen during that season, right? So 70% of the time, I'll talk about seasonality, and it'll play out how it normally does, right? It's like the stock market. We said the stock market will likely get a 5 to 10% correction in August, September, October, and it did. Right? I said Bitcoin would likely fall below its bull market support band in August or September because of a correction in the S&P, and it did. I said Bitcoin will likely experience a red September because it usually does, except for maybe 2 or 3 of the months, 2 or 3 of the years where it was a green September, and it didn't. It was a green September. So seasonality does not always give you what's going to happen. It just tells you what is most likely to happen based on what has happened in the past. Every single time, though, it does not have to play out in the same way. So I look at the Ether Bitcoin chart and I tell myself, I was so confident right here that it was going to break down. And when it did break down, I was so confident it was going to keep on breaking down. And I was humbled like crazy, right? And I won't forget that. I mean, honestly, one of the biggest lessons I've learned in this market cycle is to be a lot more humble about these predictions, because I was so convinced it was going to break down. It did. I was like, I was right? This thing's going lower. Back up to higher than where I converted my ETH to Bitcoin in the first place. Now the trade has worked out brilliantly, right? Because I converted a lot over here. From then, it's down about 30%, right? Ether's down against Bitcoin 30%, and that was where I converted my ETH to Bitcoin, a lot of it. But I look at it today, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if it's going to break down or not. I think the most likely direction is down, but I also know there's some seasonality associated with this. And if it doesn't break down by the end of December, then it might get a bounce back up. Now, it might not be to new highs. It might not be to new cycle highs, but it could, could come back up a little bit. The one thing I look at is I look at this. This went exactly how we said it was likely going to go. I can't tell you how many people said this was going to break to the upside. I said, no, it's likely going to break down. And it did. And then after it broke down, we said, all right, now that it broke down, it will likely backtest. If I can find this. Once it breaks down here, I said it'll likely backtest this area. And it did. The 058. The same area that it kept finding support at, this trend line. The fourth attempt, that's where it broke down. I've noticed a lot of times it's that fourth test of the trend line that tends to do it in. The fourth test. 1, 2, 3, 4. Down. Back test. 058. Where's the bull market support band? 05941 to 0.06. And it's dropping too. So you could get a scenario, if you guys remember, where one of two things happen, right? Either Bitcoin's going to go up or down. If it goes sideways, then so be it, but it's still going to make a decision eventually. If it goes up, what's going to happen? Dominance goes up. If dominance goes up, Ether Bitcoin breaks down. More than likely. What about the other case? What if Bitcoin goes down? Well, we showed you the lower time frames, the hourly chart, remember? Where Bitcoin is putting in higher highs and Ethereum is putting in lower lows. So I can't help but think the most likely direction is down. But I am not going to sit here and say that is what has to happen, because that is what I thought over here, and you can see what came after that. So I maintain that the most likely outcome is for this to break down, and it could occur on a Bitcoin rally. One of the things I have been consistent with is that Bitcoin rallies in pre-halving years, what they do is they break all Bitcoin pairs down below support levels. And arguably, the last thing that needs to fall below its support level is Ethereum on its Bitcoin pair. That's the last thing. If you ignore the wicks, kind of looks like it already has, right? We're spending a lot of time down here, and we didn't really spend a lot of time down here in 2022, right? Like there were some wicks down here. We didn't really spend that much time down at these levels. Not only do you have the SPY ETF for Bitcoin, I mean, I get there could be one for Ethereum as well, but there could be more regulatory uncertainty with that. But you also have the halving coming up, right? You also are still in high interest rates. Last cycle, dominance didn't even top until after we saw the Fed cut. So I can't help but think the most likely direction is for it to break down. It could happen on a Bitcoin rally. Could happen on a Bitcoin dump. I don't really care. I have Bitcoin. I'm fine either way. And if Bitcoin drops a lot, that's what I have cash for. If there's a recession, I don't know. I don't know when it's going to occur. I don't know if it'll be now, 3 months from now, 9 months from now. I don't know. I really don't. I do know that Bitcoin leads bull markets, and the dominance will tend to go higher in during most of that period. 1, 2, 3, 4 is where it broke down. Again, this chart, good chance it does not work. Good chance it could break to the upside, and we will just pretend like this, I won't say pretend like it never happened, because the receipts will be there just showing the chart in the first place. But if it comes back down to this area, if it cannot break above, let's say 2,300, and it comes back down and tags this trend line again, that's the fourth tag. That could be where it drops. So I think it's worthwhile to sort of look at this and say, you know what? Bitcoin has been relatively stronger than Ethereum. And if Bitcoin were to rally and it breaks Ether Bitcoin off of 0.049, then where's the support for Ether Bitcoin, right? Where is support? I don't know, 0.042? 0.037? I don't know. There's not a lot of support in here, right? It just went straight up. So I don't know where it would be exactly. So that's kind of, what I'm thinking about. To sort of summarize, I have Bitcoin in case the market keeps climbing the wall of worry. And I've said that for over a year, okay? I think that, it's common for markets to rally into recessions. And if we don't get a recession, then, sort of the big one, right? The big drop may never happen. Historically, there is a 40 to 50% drop by Bitcoin, sometime late pre-halving year or early halving year. I don't know if it'll happen or not, but historically there has been. And so, we'll continue to think that that is a potential outcome, although it doesn't have to be what happens, but it is a potential outcome. So that is why I have some Bitcoin. But I also have cash in case a recession unfolds. And the reason a recession could unfold is because historically the Fed has been unable to get inflation durably back to target without undergoing a recession. As you can see, these gray shaded regions are recessions, and you can see that a lot of times we have these peaks, we're in a recession. You might say, well, it's come down a lot and we're not in a recession. Well, not yet. And who knows? Maybe we are in one. If you go look at things like the Som Rule Recession Indicator, we're trending towards one, right? If we get an unemployment rate printing like above 4% and stuff, we'll probably trigger this, which historically has coincided with recessions, generally speaking. If you look at it per state, right? We sort of coded it up here per state. Some of them look okay. Some of them look not okay. Look at California. That one already triggered. You might say, oh, well, that's proof that the recession is here. No, look at Connecticut. It's all the way down here. Look at Delaware. It's all the way down here too. But then look at the District of Columbia. Well, what's it doing? It got triggered back in March. Right? So, there's so many different indicators. There's so many different ways that we could look at this. I've sort of explained the way I'm doing it. I will say that, again, and I already said this previously, but I just want to sort of clarify one more time. In the halving year, I'm going to sort of relinquish my view on the altcoin market. Mainly because I really don't want to have to continue to sort of defend the, sort of this Bitcoin dominant stuff. I think dominance is going higher, but a lot of people don't care. So, the halving year, we typically reach a point where altcoins turn the tide against Bitcoin if they haven't already. And so I just wanted to sort of just be transparent with you guys that I will relinquish my view on the altcoin market in the halving year, not because I think that they can't keep bleeding, because I think many of them probably will, but I don't want to only harp on this stuff and sort of feel the wrath of crypto Twitter anytime there's a move in the altcoin market. Because I mean honestly, like I just want to try to help, and if the Bitcoin dominant stuff isn't helping, then it isn't helping. So I feel like we're getting pretty late in the business cycle. It could drag on for a little bit longer, but these are my thoughts on the market. Total 3 has put in a higher high. Here to acknowledge that. I'm not going to try to go hide behind a bush and pretend like it's not happening. It happened. I think the thing to look for confirmation that alts are worth the risk against Bitcoin is can they break out of this? Because so far they haven't. Can they break out of this? And total 2 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin looks even worse. You know why it looks worse? Because total 2 includes ETH, and ETH has not looked good for a long time. Look at the Ethereum dominance. Look at this. It just keeps going down. So I think 2024 will be a very interesting year. I think there's going to be, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty because it's an election year. A lot of people have said, well, you can't have recessions in election years. They won't let it happen. What about 2020, 2008, 2000, 1980, all recessions, all election years, right? It can happen. In fact, uncertainty can maybe even make it more likely to happen, but it can happen. Should you bet everything on it happening? Probably not, right? Probably not. Should you be prepared in case it does happen? Probably. Total market cap has put in a higher high as well, right? Total 2 hasn't, right? I mean, again, this includes ETH. It's really struggled. Total 3 is sort of above the 2023 high, but still below the Q3 2022 high. So it's almost a reverse of what we saw over here, right? This rally that we got late pre-halving year, or really, like late pre-halving year is when it started going into the early part of the halving year. It topped out below this high, but above the Q3 2018 high, right? You can see that's where it topped out. So far, this rally by total 3 has gone above the 2023 high, but it's still below the Q3 2022 high. So it's almost the reverse of what this one was over here. Right? So these are essentially my unfiltered views on the market, right? I can appreciate why people are excited about the altcoin market. It's the first higher high in 2.5 years, and you should be excited about finally seeing some change in the market. I can appreciate the frustration that people have when we talking about Bitcoin dominance all the time because they don't care about alt Bitcoin pairs. I can appreciate that. I appreciate, I can appreciate some of the mocking of me that goes on Twitter. I can, because I don't get everything right. I can appreciate why people feel that way. I can also appreciate why I'm following my strategy of a Bitcoin heavy crypto portfolio because I think the dominance is going higher. and having cash on hand in case a recession hits. I can appreciate all that. So I would say in the halving year, look for me to, you'll probably see me maybe present things in a different way. I don't know. But I know the sort of the Bitcoin dominant stuff is getting on everyone's nerves. So those are my views on the market. We'll see how things shape up here over the next few months. We'll see if Bitcoin, sort of just finalize things. I don't know if Bitcoin's going to get this correction back down to the 100-week SMA. It historically does. And if we go into a recession, then the 100-week SMA will be an optimistic place to stop. Could certainly go lower and break support at lower levels, just like we did we broke these levels when the recession hit over there. So I would look to that as something that we would have to sort of contend with. We broke out of the 100-week SMA just like 2019, just like we did over here in 2015. Both of those times we did eventually test the 100-week SMA. Both of those times also we tested the bull market support band. We tested it right here. We also, after breaking above right here, we eventually tested it, and over here we broke through it. So we'll probably test those at some point in the coming months. Could we go higher first? Absolutely. Right? Anything's possible. But I'm guessing that these supports don't actually break until a recession arrives, if a recession arrives. If a recession arrives, I think these supports break. If a recession does not arrive and we get the elusive soft landing, then the people that were basically 0% cash will be rewarded more than the people that had a sizable cash position, because they took on more risk, sort of assuming that we would not have a recession, and there's a chance that they could be right. But that's what I would look for, especially, again, seasonality, right? Seasonality always gets me into trouble, but year-to-date ROI sort of shows, at least in the last, if you look at 2019, 2023, there was a little bit of a pullback going in. So, if Bitcoin did something like this, it would basically correspond to it sort of pulling back to the lower 30Ks, maybe the low to mid 30Ks going into the end of the year, especially if the hype around the spot ETF sort of dies out. But if they approve the spot ETF, then it could go up aggressively very, very quickly, and then sort of top out for a while, and then sort of fade until we get back to sort of QE or something. But I think we'll wrap it up there. This video has gone on long enough. Those are my views on the market. I tried to answer as many as sort of these questions that I've seen, and I just want to be open and honest about sort of where I see ourselves in this market. I just remember one last thing. The Bitcoin logarithmic regression rainbow. If you guys remember the 2.5 log rule, 2.5 log lines down, just so you know, 2.5 log lines down from this one puts you at this here, which is around 46K, I don't know if it's going to make it there. And you might say, well, Ben, 46K, that's a pretty low target, right? That's what it is now, right? In 2025, this log line will be north of 100K, okay? So, don't get too upset because it's only at 46K. In 2019, when Bitcoin rallied up to this level, the 2.5 log line rule would have said the top was at 16K, just north of where it went. But by the time we actually went to 2.5 log lines, it was at 69K. But that was like 2 years later, more than 2 years later. So in the same way, you could be seeing something play out in a similar manner, where it's like either stops here, about half a log line away from where it eventually tops out in 2 years or something, kind of like what it did over here. Or maybe you'll even go up all the way to that point, sort of stop at around 46K or something, and then fade, and then go back up into, once we get back to QE. There's a lot of ways that you can look at this market. I could think of 1,000 reasons why it could go up or down in the short term. But that's the great thing about markets, right? Everyone's got their own opinion, and that's what makes the market the market. We all have our own opinions as to what's going to happen, and that's why we get all this volatile price action. So if we do get a pullback, look to see if these prior highs can hold. If they don't hold, then that's a sign that we're likely going into a recession, and then we'll have to contend with that. Otherwise we'll see if the higher lows are maintained. Anyways, if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. See you guys next time. Bye.